Welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. I am Douglas Peak, and I am your Salty Pastor. And one of the goals of the Salty Pastor is help you grow in your faith. We're here to coach you up. And we do this in a number of basic ways. One of the things that we attempt to do is we try to be an add-on or an encouragement to those who are involved in a local church. They have a pastor, they're going, but they want to dig a little deeper into the history or specific statements that are made in the New Testament, and then how they apply to everyday life so that you can grow your faith. The second thing is that we really help those people who are followers of Christ, but for some reason or another, they're not a part of a local fellowship, which is fine. And so our goal is to help you be coached up in your faith. And then finally, those people who might be asking questions and kind of seeking out God and wondering, wow, what is the rational basis for faith? And so I think it's very important to understand is that we're here to coach people in their faith. We're not here to tell you what to eat, what to wear, what music to listen to. We're not here to tell you where to live. We're not here to tell you who to vote for or any of these types of religious things that I guess would be considered religious in nature. What we're here to do is we're here to help you to discover the authentic Jesus and for you to meet him and then you to grow in your faith. And one of the things that we attempt to do that a lot of times doesn't happen in a local church is that we try to focus on the fact that your faith is an intellectually sound belief system, that it is highly rational, extremely reasonable, and that is the primary reason why it has shaped Western civilization. You would not have an America, you would not have any democracies, you would not have anything that even closely resembles what we have today without Christianity in the Western world. Now, if you've traveled much and you've gone outside of the Western world, like Europe and America, North America, then what you're going to find are two basic things. You're going to find third world countries, and you're going to find countries that tend to be either totalitarian, meaning there's a dictator, or they are Islamic countries. And most of these countries tend to be third world countries, unless they're oil countries, meaning that predominant amount of their GDP is derived from the production and sale of oil or petroleum. Now, what's really interesting is when you compare the countries that are out there that are that way and Western countries, you really start to understand the influence and power of Christianity. Now, there's a world-renowned historian by the name of Tom Holland. He is not the actor who plays Spider-Man, even though they have the same name. He's quite a bit older, and he is considered a scholar. He's from the UK, and he wrote a book called Dominion. And basically what he does is he goes back historically, and he shows the overwhelming influence of Jesus Christ and his teachings, and then his followers on Western civilization. And he attributes basically about everything to the influence of Jesus Christ. Now, why is it important for you to know that? Well, I think it's important for you to know that if you want to grow in your faith, to realize that what you believe is not silly. Now, you live in a world where you're constantly pummeled in America today that what you believe is either outdated, right? It's patriarchal, it's archaic, or it is false at some level. And due to this fact of these messages that you get constantly, it really can undermine your confidence that what you believe is not only tried and true, but it's been tested through thousands of years of rigorous scrutiny and rigorous evaluation, and it always comes up winning again and again and again. So I think it's important to understand that. And that's why history and the study of history, and that's why, understanding the philosophical context in which Christianity was birthed and has influenced since its day of birth, is so important for your own personal growth in your faith. And it also helps you in the challenge aspect. It's really interesting because in America today, The belief is that what I think secular humanists and atheists and Marxists, cultural Marxists, and leftist progressive want you to believe is that Christianity is waning, that people don't really care in Christianity, and that Christianity has had its time in the sun, and now it's time to be put away on the bookshelf for the annals of history. But this is just simply not true. This is not the reality, because what is different in Christianity and all other religions is not that it's just true, but that it never intended to be a religion, right? And so it always intended to be a reflection of reality. So it's really fascinating because there's unmitigating truths, they're axiomatic truths, right? They're foundational truths that have never changed, and they are objective and outside of us. They never will change. But inside of that, because it's not intended to be a religion, it's incredibly flexible. It's incredibly moldable into any and all cultures. And that's what's really quite amazing about it, is that you take these unchangeable truths, who God is, who we are, who Jesus is, and what he did on the cross, and you take that to any culture, and what it does is, instead of forcing the culture that it's introduced to adapt to it, what it does is the truth of it enters into the culture and then starts to transform the culture from the inside out. It's absolutely one of the most fascinating anthropological studies over the last 2,000 years that you could ever do. This is in contrast to Islam. Islam goes in and wipes out the old culture and imposes its culture. And anybody who resists this process is eliminated. It's kind of like, I remember Star Trek: The Next Generation. It's like the Borg, resistance is futile. They come in, they assimilate you into their culture. And if you don't assimilate, then you are eliminated. And this is historical fact. This is not some opinion of mine. It's just the fact of how it operates. So why is it important for you to understand this? Well, because when you start reading the Bible for yourself, it's very important to understand this context, this historical context in which you are reading. Now, there's a lot of debate right now about the importance of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and why are they together in the Christian Bible? Well, for a couple reasons. Number one is the Old Testament. Before I kind of give you the reasons why, let me give you a little context. The Old Testament is the revelation of God in the Old Covenant. This is a contract, basically. It's called a covenant between God and the Israelite people. These are ethnically Jewish people, and it revolves around the kingdom of Israel, okay? It was a kingdom. It wasn't a country or an empire. It was a kingdom. And initially, God was the king for 400 years when they came back from Egypt and possessed the promised land. And then what happened is they wanted a king, and so they got a king. And then the kings just kind of were a disaster, and then the kings were wiped out. And then Jesus comes, and so the New Testament is about Jesus Christ and how he is the new covenant. There is a new contract between God and humanity. And so people are like, well, since the new contract is all about Jesus, let's just get rid of the Old Testament. We don't need it. Well, what's really important to understand is that the Old Testament exists because it was the scriptures from which the apostles and early followers, Paul included, argued that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, it's really important to understand this, is that in Jewish culture and in the rabbinical literature, not just the Old Testament, they believe in a Messiah. Now, many Orthodox Jews, not all, but many believe that the Messiah is a political leader, similar to the political leaders that the Israelites wanted when God said, okay, let's start with Saul, and then there was David, then there was Solomon, and then there's this whole string of fats, Jehoshaphat, Hisaphat. I mean, there's a lot of fats at the end of it, and that's not talking about their girth. That's just the end of their name. It's like many of the nations that fought against Israelites early on who were the ites, the Hittites, the Amalekites. There's just a lot of ites in there. So that's kind of how I categorize them. It's funny, and it's a great way to remember it. But there was a lot of kings. And so what happened is the Old Testament prophets, you have major prophets and minor prophets, and that's what all those books with all those funny names are at the end of the Old Testament. And what you find is that they all talk about the coming Messiah. The person who really prophesied the most about the Messiah was probably Isaiah. And now you might say, okay, so what? Let's just get rid of the Old Testament, because Jesus came and he fulfilled everything God wanted to do. That is true. But what it does is it gives us context to understand the teaching of the first century Christians, followers of Christ, and what they wrote in the New Testament, because many of these people were Jewish, right? You look at the Gospels that are the biographies on the life of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what you find is these are biographies written by Jewish people. Now, there's some question about Luke, who was the physician and historian that traveled with Paul. But most people believe, yeah, he's Jewish. He was of Jewish ethnicity, Jewish enculturation. And so when you study the biographies of Jesus, you really need to understand the Old Testament covenant and how Jews thought in order to understand the Gospel of Matthew. It makes sense. It's more cool, because what you have to realize is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and even John, these people were nerds. I mean, Matthew was a Jewish nerd, right? And so his gospel is super nerdy for Jewish people. And that's why it was so powerful and so convincing. So you have in the New Testament, you have a deeper understanding when you keep the Old Testament. And herein lies the biggest problem, is that so many people take the Old Testament and the New Testament and they try to tie them together in a seamless revelation. Now, is that wrong? No. Because people say, well, it's a story of God, and we need to understand that. And in a lot of ways you do, because, as I said, Jewish people wrote the Bible. You look at the beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, and it starts with the garden, right? People walking with God. And then you go to the end at the book of Revelation, and it ends back in the garden, right? Living with God and the new world and the new earth and so forth. So it's obviously meant to bookend, right? So everything in it is important, but you have to really clearly understand the demarcation between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But what some people try to do is they try to say, well, everything in the Old Testament is still binding on everybody in the New Testament. And so you have a whole denomination in America called the Seventh-day Adventists, and they still worship. They have their worship services on Saturday. And on Sunday, the doors are closed, which, by the way, is really one of the ways that church planters are able to start churches, because they'll come in and they'll have worship services on Sundays. So they'll rent the Seventh-day Adventist building to have services on Sundays. So that's just a little factoid that I'm not sure how it's pertinent to this discussion. But what I want you to get a hold of, and what I want people who listen to the Salty Pastors understanding, is that the Old Testament and the New Testament are symbiotic. They're meant to be together, right? But you have to understand the nature of that relationship. Otherwise, it leads to all sorts of misunderstanding and beliefs like, well, you're required to keep the Sabbath again. Well, if you just read the book of Galatians, you see that Paul not only said you don't have to be circumcised, he also talks about all kinds of things in the Old Testament and the Jewish law that you've been set free from. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous passages in the book of Galatians, which is a really important one that I really like, is in Galatians chapter 5, and where Paul says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." What is the yoke of slavery that he's discussing? He's talking about the Old Testament law, right? If you really want to understand the difference between the Old Testament law and Christianity, then you read the book of Romans, because this is Paul's doctrinal treatise about how the New Testament in the revelation of Jesus is a brand new covenant between God and humanity, and that the Old Testament covenant has comparisons and similarities, but it is no longer the way in which we relate to God, right? You don't have to convert to Judaism, then follow the law in order to be in a relationship with God. You go through Jesus Christ. He displaced that. If you want to understand why you should not go back to the Old Testament law and try to live that way, that's why the book of Hebrews was written. See? So are you starting to get the picture here? Is that there's a lot more to the Bible than people normally get, and they don't see it in its context as it's a book filled with smaller books, 66 books, but they are very intentional in how they fit together. It's a God thing. This is in Paul's letter to Timothy, that all scripture is inspired by God. The term there in Greek is God-breathed. So it's meant to be together. And from the earliest days of the church, it has always been together. There's this meme going around on the internet and on TikTok where you have all these people talking about the Bible was assembled 300 years after Christ died. It was voted on by the Council of Nicaea, and that is just a bunch of horsepucky. It's a big lie. This goes around all the time. We have manuscripts now from the very first century. We know from a scholarly standpoint that, Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and there's another meme going around on the internet and TikTok and everything else saying that, these books were written much later and the authors' names weren't on it. Of course, this was very common to not, you didn't sign your work because you weren't writing a book for yourself, right? You were recording the life of Jesus. And so we know that Matthew wrote Matthew, and Mark wrote Mark, and Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. We know that Paul wrote all these letters. Now, a lot of people go around and try to discredit this so that you don't have to listen to it. Well, you don't have to listen to it. But it is true. You don't have to believe it, but it is true. And so, there's even a meme going around there on TikTok, and a lot of people will say in public education classes of private schools that Jesus never existed. This is all false. It's just completely ridiculous. And what it is it's an attempt by secular humanists and non-religious people and atheists and other religious beliefs to try to say, well, I don't have to take it seriously. And the reason why is because the impact that it has had on the world is incomparable to any other belief system that has ever existed. And the manner in which it's impacted the world has been unlike any other belief system in the history of the world, right? If you were to say, is a metaphor or analogy, that America is the most unique nation that ever existed in the history of all nations in the world, you'd be correct. It is unique. And what has it accomplished? And the amount of prosperity and freedom and liberty that it has brought. Of course, now I believe today all of that's being threatened. And the reason why it's being threatened is because of the law of entropy. When you look at 10,000 years, 15,000, we have probably about 7,000 to 10,000 years of recorded human history, right? You look through all that, and what you find is basically 9,750 years, pretty miserable. It was either even though there are great advancements. You look at the Roman Empire and everything it achieved. That's why even today we still look back and study it, because even though it was 2,000 years ago, it's just unbelievable. In many ways, it's unmatched. They still have engineering projects today that modern day engineers still don't know how they did it. And that's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Now, but back to my earlier point, and that is that you look at the reason why America is under threat is because the tendency of all things is a law of entropy, and that is to revert to its natural state, which is chaos, anarchy, and a mess, right? It's not to have a city on a hill like America where the citizens have a say and they are able to have freedom and liberty, right? That's such a rarity. And so the natural, if we just let nature take its course, America won't exist anymore. That's why it has to be fought for. And this is why Ronald Reagan said that every generation needs to fight for liberty, right? We're just one generation away from the loss of freedom in America. And of course, these radical organizations and ideologies knew this, and that's why they took over our public education system, and that's why the vast majority of kids that are educated love socialism, and then they go to university and they get it on steroids. And this is all pure absurdity. But back to my point. That was a little digression, so please forgive me. But back to my point, and that is that how do you wade through that which will destroy America and that which is a non-issue? How do you wade through in your own life? Where are those truths that are unchangeable that I have to hold on to no matter what? I can never change these beliefs in these truths, but at the same time, give liberty and freedom to everybody else around me. And the way you understand this and the way you figure this out is by understanding the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament and the relationship that they have with one another. And I think that in and of itself is what's critical, because even there are specific truths that never change. Who is God? Who are we? What did Christ do on the cross? Why did he do it? Those are unchangeable truths. But man, do the followers of Jesus have a tendency to religiosity everything. And we start saying, well, you have to believe this, and you have to wear these clothes or listen to this music, and this. And so this is called moralism. And that is we find security not in our faith in Jesus Christ, but in our own moral perpetuity. Another way to say it is our own moral superiority over somebody else. I'm more right morally than you. I'm a better person than you. And of course, this is all antithetical to the intent of Christianity. The whole point of Christianity is that we accept the fact that we're flawed. We are broken. We've been tainted by cancer. It's called sin. And because of that, we must be redeemed by the blood of Christ. Once I live that, experience that, I will grow into a better person. And I am transformed into a better person, not through moralism, but through the redemptive act of the Holy Spirit working in my life on a regular basis. Does that make sense? And so it takes the whole judgy thing right out of it. But this is really, really hard, because I have never been a part of a church community where there wasn't a group of people that are super judgy. Just never happened. And I think that's just one of the flaws of what it means to be human beings. And we're not going to get away from that until Jesus comes and we have the new heaven and the new earth, right? But what I wanted to really give you today is just a challenge as we start talking about some new things before we go into Christmas. Because when Thanksgiving hits and Christmas hits, I just want to spend time teaching and focusing on the beauty and the wonder of what Christ did and why we celebrate his birth and how redemption is what we need today more than anything else. We don't need more rules. We don't need more principles. What we need is just more Jesus. We've made this so complicated in churches that we've just lost, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians says, I don't want you to lose the simplicity of devotion to Jesus. It's just simple. And we need to get back to this simple devotion to Jesus, okay? And we need to get away from the moralism out there in all of its different forms. And only then, I believe, are we going to see people rise up and say, hey, I know Jesus, and that ideology over there, that's not Jesus. That social movement over there, that's not Jesus. Yeah, that over there, that political thing, that's not Jesus. And it's going to allow us to keep America functioning and moving. But if we lose the purity and simplicity of devotion to Christ, if we lose the essence of what redemption really is, then what happens is Christianity just becomes another social movement to fight with other social movements. And instead of standing on truth and standing on transformational redemption in Jesus, what happens is it just becomes another, tit for tat battle with these other ideologies. Now, that doesn't mean that there comes a time when you have to fight, right? As a nation, as a citizen. This is secondary to your relationship with Jesus. This is extant. It's outside of your faith, but your faith is what drives you to have a conviction. And this is what happened to our forefathers. And that is originally they didn't want to start their own nation. If you go back and read our history, what they wanted to do is they just wanted reform. They said, look, we want some autonomy here. We want some reform here. We're not going to be conscripted into fighting your wars and taxed to death. Well, King George didn't like that. And so they came in, they called it seditionist rebellion. And so then they declared independence. Continental Congress did. And that is the famous Declaration of Independence, when we decided to declare independence. They did that knowing full well that they would have to go to war to defend that. And so in the same way, I think it's important to understand is that in your own life, on a personal level, when it comes to your faith, you're going to have to declare what you believe, and then you're going to have to go to war to defend it. What do I mean by that? Well, you're going to have to declare, this is what I believe, and I know why I believe it, and so now I need to go to war with the things spiritually, first and foremost, that are going to try to destroy that. I've got to go to war with all of the things in my life that I worship instead of Jesus. I have got to be ruthlessly honest. I have to go to war with my own dishonesty. I have to go to war with my own flawed perspective. I have to go to war with my own need to trust things instead of trusting Jesus. And this is why transparency and openness is so critical to spiritual growth. Now, I don't mean transparent and open with your next door neighbor or, the gossip girl down the street. I don't mean that. What I mean is in your own self-evaluation with God, right? In your walk with Jesus is instead of asking God to give you what you want, ask God how you can change into being in full alignment with Him. So you just have to ruthlessly go to war with the world and its influence on you and your faith, right? The second thing you've got to do is you've got to ruthlessly go to war with your own shortcomings and how they impact the people around you that you love. I'm going to say some really salty things right here is if you're a female and you're unhappy with your husband and you've been married for 10, 15 years, if it's not abuse, and I hate to give that caveat, you know why? Because so many women say everything's abuse now. Over the years, I had hundreds of women come into my office when I was a pastor, sit down and say, my husband's abusing me. And I'm like, well, can I see the bruises? Well, he's verbally abusing me. You're like, okay, what does that mean? Well, he said this. And I was like, well, what did you say before he said that? Well, that doesn't matter what I said. Well, yes, it does. Because if you're talking about verbal abuse, then women can be just as verbally abusive as men can be verbally abusive. And then there's the catch-all, and so, pardon me for being so salty here, but emotional abuse. I don't believe emotional abuse is real. I really don't. And I know that's salty and controversial. Somebody's probably going to clip this and then have me canceled at YouTube, but that's okay. And here's the reason why is because all psychologists, everybody teaches this over and over again, is that you have emotions and your emotions are real, but your emotions are you. Of all things, I was listening to a Spanish actress who's very famous in America. I'll leave her name out. And she was talking about her emotional world. And she says, why do you let people offend you, right, or hurt you emotionally? And the gal goes, well, because it's real and blah, 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 blah. And so she speaks in Spanish. And what she does is she insults the person. And the person looks at her, and says, well, what did you just say? She goes, well, see, what I just did is I insulted you in a language that you don't understand. It had no effect on you. Now, if I use English and I insult you, then you're going to be wounded. Okay, so who's in charge of the wound? Is it the person speaking or the person hearing? And the journalist, like the light bulb went off and said, the person hearing. Exactly, she points out. So that's what I mean is that emotional abuse is something that people who are very insecure, right, use as a catch-all. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because I don't want to give the caveat unless there's abuse. Now, is there bad behavior? Yeah. All the time. I don't know two people that are married where they're not jerks, towards one another, and they don't do bad things. So you say, oh, okay, we have bad behavior here. And how does the bad behavior affect the covenant and the breaking of covenant? That's a totally different argument than, well, I'm not happy because I'm being abused and I want out. And so my point in saying and bringing all this up is that I have had so many people come into my office and say, well, I'm being abused. That's why I need out. And I'm like, well, the reason you're not happy in your marriage, the reason you're not satisfied is because of you. And because of you're not willing to do the work on yourself first. And that's why we have a legion of divorced people. And some people say, well, you're just wanting people to stay married because no, that's not why I'm sharing this at all. Research shows that people that stay married have the highest level of probability for happiness. And that's what this is about. This is how to coach you up in your face so that you can be happy. Now, there might be bad behavior. There may be an addiction. There may be real physical abuse, or there may be something that makes it impossible for you to be married to this person. And there's a divorce. The Bible talks about that, right? It talks about conditions and criteria under which that's acceptable. And it happens, right? It happened 2,000 years ago in the New Testament. It's happening today. That's a different discussion. What I'm talking about is the notion that if you're not happy in your marriage, if you want to find happiness and joy in life, then start doing the work on yourself first, because that's what the gospel is all about. You have to ruthlessly go to war with the things that are stealing your happiness. And oftentimes, it's that which you allow in your closest relationships, right, to annoy you and to affect you in a negative way. Boy, that's pretty dicey, isn't it? Well, let's leave it there. And I'm going to sign off now. And we're going to be back on Thursday, and we're going to dig deeper into this notion of what things should you go to war with if you make a declaration that you are free in Christ. Until then, go over to our website and click on the email button. You can just go right there and sign up for the email that goes out each week. You can also go over to our YouTube channel and like and subscribe. Just like and subscribe. We're slowly growing over there, and we think it's awesome. So until then, God bless you, and remember, what you believe is one of the most important things about you.